Nathan Spencer, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, mate. Very humbling to be invited on. Looking forward to having a chat, and appreciate the invite and the good work that you're doing in our space as well.
No, thank you very much. It's going to be an interesting one because you've had lots of different experiences across lots of different environments. Most recently, the NBA, and then coming back home to NSWIS, New South Wales Institute of Sport, working with under a couple of previous or former podcast guests, Alex Natera and Simon Harries. So it's great to get you on. Just before we do dive into the stuff that we're going to have a little chat around, which is around some of the things that you did in Orlando, would you mind just giving us a bit of a brief background and info on that?
Yeah,
the various experiences you've had.
Yep. As you said, very fortunate, I guess, to work in a number of different environments, domestically, internationally, with elite, semi-elite, pro, weekend warrior, and now institute setting, and then also privately as well. So definitely taught me a lot about managing up, managing down, stakeholders, reporting in different scenarios, and then also too, just the fact that the goalposts never change. You're still here to provide us a service support to the athletes that you work with, and a lot of great influences and mentors and exposures to different systems. And in every single place, I've learned a lot about myself as a coach, but as a person and as well. So it's been a different journey. Starting out in NRL junior pathway systems as volunteer, intern, honorarium, like everyone I think sort of does, before transitioning into the NBL with Illawarra Hawks, or during all this time still working full time in a clinical role as a clinical EP initially with hip, knee, back, orthopedic surgery, rehabilitation, and then after completing my Masters of High Performance Sport at ACU, mutual connections with Chad Kolasic put us in touch with some people in the States, being Dave Tenney, and he was at the Magic at the time, and that led me over to the States for a 4-year period, and then now back here, home soil, at NSWIS, with a great group of people doing some really good work, as you said, headed up by Alex Natera for the sports science department, and Simon Harries overseeing the strength and conditioning department. So really enjoying my time working with women's water polo, which is foreign, female athletes and water sport. Never done that, but loving every minute of it.
Nice, mate. So what's the transition been like from, I'm guessing, a super, super hectic NBA schedule, which probably never stops, to an institute environment?
It's been slow, which has been, I guess, that the pace is, as you said, drastically reduced, which has been welcomed. I feel like I have a relationship with my wife for the first time in 4.5, nearly 5 years. So that's nice. The work-life balance has definitely shifted, and the amount of face-to-face work I have with the athletes is significantly reduced, given that it's in an institute setting. It's obviously they're not professional, they're not paid, they're elite but amateur in the sense of working towards Olympic campaigns, and obviously Paris is knocking on our door and almost tomorrow it'll feel like. So that has really given me a lot of additional time to invest into other projects, whether it be hard skill development, which is a big piece of what we're doing here at NSWIS with our strength science journey, a more targeted approach to CPD, which I'm really proud to be a part of, and passion projects as well on the side. So just really enjoying the change of pace and not being on the go, as you said all the time, and landing at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and then back into work at 9 a.m. and having an 82 game schedule over over 6 months of the year is quite congested, and there's a lot of highs with it, but it can be difficult to navigate at times as well, and especially during COVID and the bubble and all those types of things that I've gone through with not having a single season which was the same. That was really just through different challenges to navigate throughout the time I was there as well. But generally a great experience.
I'd like to dive into some of the challenges and some of the realities of work in the NBA because, especially here, and I'm guessing it's the same in Oz, you probably look at American sports and there's a lot of practitioners out there who would just kill for the chance to get out there and experience that. And not to say that it doesn't live up to expectation. I'm sure a lot of the time it does, but there's obviously some challenges to that. And speaking to people who are in the NBA currently, who have contracts with organizations, maybe we'll tell you the truth, but maybe just err on the side of caution with saying. I'm not saying that you're going to go to town on like talking about this or that, but I just for someone that stepped away for whatever reason and gone back to the role that you've currently got, what are some of the challenges and realities of working in that type of environment?
It's a question that I get asked all the time, and having to answer that now on a few occasions, the best way I can sum it up is that, ironically, the IRS classifies the NBA as an entertainment industry for tax purposes. So you pay your taxes based on the entertainment rates. And I think that speaks a lot about the way the league is set up, in that it's an entertainment-based game, in that the TV revenue rights are obviously astronomical, second in the US, obviously, to the NFL, which, again, is huge. The players have such a high share of that. So to get the share, they need to play the games. So to play the games, you have a high schedule. The players obviously then have a significant amount of control in the off season. With they want their downtime, and they want to play, they want to earn the money, and the staff earn the money as well. That all comes back to resources, to staff budgets, and the league can excel in a number of different ways because of the revenue that it generates. So there's so many positives that come out of that. But as a result, the way that the CBA is set up, and the way that even geographical location, which, if you're not familiar with the US, Orlando is in the southeastern corner of the states in Florida, and the simple rule of the 1 a.m. rule with the CBA, which I think now has been changed to 2 o'clock in the morning, where if you land in a market city for a game or for a training session or whatever it might be, you can't officially mandate it. But it also doesn't count as an off day. So teams like ourselves, the Miami Heat, and I think the team that probably had it the worst, to be honest, would be, say, the New Orleans Pelicans, where they're in a central time zone but playing in the Western Conference. So they're back and forth between Mountain and then Pacific in LA quite frequently. You're very rarely returning home before 1 o'clock in the morning. So there's the sleep deprivation and performance effects that come off the back of that, obviously. But then your ability to affect change as a result of those rules is dependent on where you're located. So, arguably teams, say, like Milwaukee, who are in the central time zone but play on the Eastern Conference, they could be playing in New York for a 7 p.m. tip-off and still be getting back home, landing before 1 a.m. So the following day either can count as an off day or they can use it for training, or players can get the additional sleep that they need. So there's those subtle nuances that impact every team differently. Yes, you fly charter jet everywhere you go. There's only a couple of teams that own planes, but there's only 9 chartered aircraft through Delta that the NBA and not quite the NFL, but the Major League Soccer and baseball share, and so do some collegiate teams as well. So when you're trying to book flights, it's done the moment the schedule's released, essentially. So you know what you're doing every day for the whole year. And you don't have much wiggle room there. And you look at what's happened recently with hurricanes and weather delays and all those things that you just don't understand the implications of until you're actually in it. So there's some of the things that were really eye-opening for me, and I still to this day can recount some specific instances where we think we're going to land at a certain place and we just didn't, because it was ice and de-icing on a plane, and then there was high winds and just all these things that you just don't account for. But as I said, until you're actually in it, you perhaps don't get a true gauge on what it's actually like.
Just that schedule, and everyone, like you say, at the start of the season, you know exactly what you're doing within reason, because of, there's always obviously things that come up like hurricanes and icing and de-icing and things like that. But is that a benefit that you know exactly what you're doing, so you can, to a certain extent, probably, I don't know, 80-90% of the time, know what days you're in and what days you're off? And just to compare that to something like football here, like I remember managers not telling players what the schedule is more than a couple of days in advance, because firstly we didn't know what the schedule was, whether you're going to get knocked out of a domestic cup or and just kind of the mindset of keeping athletes on the toes, so depending on results and all that kind of stuff. But was the schedule sorted ahead of time a slight benefit on that front, or not?
I think so. I think it also depends on your playing group and your roster, in my opinion. Yeah, these guys are they're incredibly skilled and they're incredibly gifted, and they have great work ethics to improve the skill element of the game, because obviously the game relies on, can you shoot or can you not, and your ability to create space to score is so critical. So quite often players will want to do the extra work to add a weapon to their, add a tool to their toolbox. So essentially every day is on, but what the day comprises, you can plan, but there's a lot of variability within that because of playing rotations. And with a squad of 15 players, you could be one turned ankle away from an athlete who may only see no minutes or 3 or 4 minutes a game if it's a blowout to them being in a high rotation. So while the overall plan may be a skeleton structure, what actually happens on a day-to-day generally won't get planned out until 48 hours or 24 hours in advance. And quite often, the final decision would be made post-game based on what information we had available, and obviously how coaches are responding to things and how the athletes are. And I think that they're those conversations that we have intuitively, regardless of what environment you're working in.
When we were batting ideas back and forth around how I could drag the most out of the experience, the NBA experience from you, you mentioned staff and staff income and that side of things, which made, maybe from a management point of view, was latter period in Orlando, made that difficult in terms of managing all this kind of stuff. Can you give us some insight into that as well?
I think it's one of those things that it's, as I said before, like the revenue that the league generates, like it is dissipated obviously in players first, but staffing sizes are just getting increasingly larger and larger and larger. And I think where it is interesting is the way that the CBA is then set up, is that every team has to have a head athletic trainer and a head strength and conditioning coach. And I think you're starting to see some job titles that are created where they don't, it's essentially the same role, but they don't fit that job title. So there's some things that management and performance directors and those types of things have to make sure that they have in place to still align the staff model with the CBA, even though that may or may not reflect what the organisation needs at the time. And I think that very fortunate that the team that I was a part of, it was almost a 1-to-1 staff to player ratio. You have 15 full-time athletes with 2 on 2-way contracts, so 17. Those other 2 would rotate between the G League and the NBA team. And to almost have 1-to-1 interaction, you're allowed to do so much. And the resources that were allocated to the performance staff was second to none. So while time for maybe formal CPD and those types of things are limited just because of how conducive the schedule is, you're given the opportunity to speak to some amazing people privately, or go and find resources to solve a specific problem if that's the case. So it's one of those things, as I said, that every team is different, but I think that the pool of money allocated towards staff will just continue to grow, and I don't think it's any secret that people in the NBA and the NFL, again from TV revenue, that's why some of the wages are perhaps some of the highest going around. And interesting, then looking at some of the salary surveys and things like that you that you're obviously a part of with things in the UK and within Europe, those things would be perhaps interesting to gather and collect. And the thing that I think plays a little bit of a part of it as well is just where you live. Florida was income tax free, which meant that a lot of the money that I earned was in my back pocket. I had to pay taxes based on states I worked in for certain amounts of days, because that's the way the entertainment taxes are set up. But the money in my back pocket would have been considerably less if I had been in, say, the LA or New York or one of those other states. So there's some things that, again, you probably don't consider when you're looking at roles in the US, just because of how the financial system works, I guess. If
it's
that
interesting.
answers the question, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one thing I did do quite a bit of work to try to get a similar survey as I've done with academy football and women's football and senior football here in the UK, rugby league, rugby union, in the NBA. But because of the situation of where teams are located, they will have different weighting based on cost of living, which is how and I spoke to you about this. I think you probably told me all this, so I'm telling you it back. So which made it quite difficult to actually get a decent comparison if it was ever going to happen in the first place. And I think it does. Yeah.
So even the little things where car insurance in Florida, in Orlando specifically, is astronomical. So like how do you account for those little things to go towards cost of living? And a wage of $50,000 in one state is not $50,000 in another. So there's probably not an equal distribution based on your specific role. It definitely fluctuates based on where you live and also what your role is as well.
Of course. Right, mate. Let's dive into the technical stuff, or more technical stuff. So, from a monitoring, profiling perspective, I suppose the first place to start is how to understand what an athlete needs to improve physically, and the assessments that you would go about performing with these athletes to try to understand that. Would you mind just giving us a bit of an intro onto your journey with this in the NBA to try to understand what athletes do need from you in terms of physical characteristics, so then you can plan interventions and go through the process?
Yeah, I definitely I had to eat a lot of humble pie when I first moved over. Whether it was arrogance or naivety, or I think rightly or wrongly, we're told that the systems that we operate within here in Australia, and I think the UK from a performance sports setting, are perhaps more advanced than others. We have this illusion that what we do is really, really good, and it is. But we can learn a lot from other environments, particularly the US. So having worked in basketball and going through 3RM, back squat, bench, chin, deadlift, and then some power derivatives with contact mat and force plates and those types of things, I just naturally assumed that would be what those guys need, and I couldn't be more wrong. Luckily, that my first role as performance and rehab coach, stepping over there, working with a guy like Luke Story, who had quite extensive experience in basketball, obviously with his time at P3, and his understanding of kinetic and kinematic variables that contributed to direct performance outcomes to improve jump height. Some of the things that he's imparted on me, I'll never forget. The first thing that hit me in the face was just how skilled these guys are, and needing to remember that basketball, but the NBA specifically, it's a skill-based sport, and they're drafted because they're gifted. So the athlete's perception and weighting on the need for, say, strength and power development may not be as imperative as what it is, say, here in Australia in the NBL, where those guys are still great athletes, but they've also experienced rugby codes and swimming, and they're probably more a multi-sport athlete and had a different strength training background. So you need to identify, obviously, the physical properties and characteristics that you're trying to improve, but the cultural backgrounds and experience of the athletes come into play. So, and ironically, basketball players jump all the time on the court, but they still have a bit of an aversion to jump testing. So there's a lot of education that goes on there, and trying to get intent out of them. And I guess part of the evolution, I guess, of some of those things can go from how do you get intent out of an athlete? You can go a counter movement jump to vertex, or like say an Abkolov jump, obviously, to drive intent with an external cue. But then does that truly tell you about their jump strategy and true kinetic and kinematic variables of how you're going to intervene? And do you get an accurate gauge of interlimb asymmetries? And obviously with that, you want to maybe be looking at a more standard counter movement jump or say a squat jump. But how do you get intent out of those jumps? So they're debates that you probably find yourself having quite internally and within your department quite regularly. And then if you're able to determine the appropriate variables on say jump strategy and making sure that they hit those markers within a jump, then your outputs are perhaps more meaningful. And I think that's something that then transitioning to working with a guy more recently in Matt Taberner, who in our space is obviously very well known for his work with the control chaos continuum and return to play and rehab, but he's an incredible strength coach, and his understanding of the properties and demands of a game and how we manipulate those things to work towards those outcomes is one of the best I've ever had the pleasure of working with. So they're some of the little things, and then your assessment can also be dependent on rookie or a vet. Quite frequently guys get drafted, as I said, because they're gifted and they may have never touched a barbell in their life. So it's selecting mechanical stresses where it's a rep max for 1, for 2, for 3, or even reps to failure. Is that appropriate? It's understanding the athlete first before you go through the assessment piece, and that was sort of the start of it. And then even like talking about draftees, they have a lot going on initially. So from an assessment and then obviously a prescription standpoint, they could be one and done fresh out of college, where they're then struggling with life admin. It's eating habits. It's being accustomed to perhaps living away from home and having to live independently for their first time. So you may or may not find that some of the assessments that you want to do from a strength and power diagnostic standpoint are actually going to be truly meaningful because they just don't put in as much, and just good, simple programming. The keep it simple, stupid approach is what is going to have the best outcome for those young guys coming through. So as I said, just keep it finding then just keeping the assessment and prescription processes very simple. And I think rarely, if you had walked into the weight room at the Orlando Magic, it was very very simple program, but a lot of thought process going into why they were doing what they were doing.
So from your research, your experience, your talking to people, having the influence of various different members of staff, what physical characteristics do athletes need to perform at the highest level in the NBA? And probably more importantly, or as well, to perform the tactical requirements that your coach required? Because that's obviously going to play a massive part in what you actually need from each athlete.
Yeah, there's obviously a huge cognitive piece to that, and that's something I think that there's a big learning transition with those athletes, particularly they come out of college and then into a league where they go from playing 20 games to playing 82. And because the incidence of training is so small, because you do the math, it's 2.4 or 2.5 games a week. I think even more. Sorry, a game every 2.5 days. Sorry. So with the CBA and geographical location, everything else we've sort of already touched on, your incidence of training and ability to retain information is so small that the team film sessions and the tactical element is done on a game day. So there's a huge learning piece to that. So having an ability to determine one, how an athlete learns, but then also the right teaching strategy for those things can be really, really important. And obviously that's that's up to the coaching staff and the support staff to specialise in those areas to determine what's best for those athletes. Physically, it's asking that question of what characteristics do they possess or do they need to possess to play the game of NBA basketball. And if we think about, okay, what does a practice or what does a game look like, you can think about, okay, there's accelerations, decelerations, change of directions, a lot of jumps. It's a 48-minute game played over a 28-meter court, and there's 2.5 hours with a lot of stoppages, so it's high intensity, intermittent nature. But that doesn't really tell me too much about the neuromuscular demands of the game. So if you think quite simply, it's just force and velocity with shortening cycle capacity. So as you then start to think about, okay, they're the characteristics I need to assess. How do I assess strength? How do I assess velocity? And specifically stretch shortening cycle, you can be looking at slow versus fast stretch shortening cycle properties. And then if I'm thinking slow, we've got obviously squat jump or counter movement jump variations to consider, given that the game is it's running, it's jumping, there's eccentric utilization there. We want to be looking at some eccentric derivatives of jumps, so we're probably going to be more biased towards counter movement jumps than we would be, say, to squat jumps. And then from a fast stretch shortening cycle capacity, we can obviously go down the route of taking stuff from perhaps Matt Jordan, where he will go through a series of different drop jumps to look at reactive strength properties, or looking more specifically at, say, a 10-5 hop, and whether we're going down bilateral or single limb derivatives of those tests, multi-planar. There's 1,000 ways to skin a cat, but what I think is really important is that you're picking the tests that are then reflective of those characteristics. We've just outlined a few of them there, and then the test battery may be athlete specific. Could be based on position. Obviously, your bigger guys are probably going to be playing a more slower, grinding style of game, a bit more physical in the paint, and external monitoring with say LPS may not truly reflect the demands of the game, as it would say for a point guard. And I know there's some stuff that's coming out. There's some literature within the NBL and European leagues, nothing so much with NBA, but we're seeing those positional discrepancies with external demands. So the strength and power profile also needs to supplement that. And then the final piece of that then too is asking what methodologies impact those properties, and I guess where it can evolve to, given the schedule that you're faced with, is that I think we find ourselves asking the question is, do we understand the game? And with, again, being able to truly assess what the internal external response is of an NBA game or of an NBA training session, what does it do to the neuromuscular system? So how do we assess that pre and post? And then what does that do to an individual athlete or to a group of athletes? And is that actually their profile? And can we actually intervene based on what the game would, or what a training session would do to them? And obviously, part of that's just being smart with progressive overload, but then looking at specific training methods in order to optimize the adaptations that occur naturally within a game or within a training session.
So would you do... Go on, mate. Sorry, I missed that.
Yes, I think that's something that we think about too. I certainly have thought about too late, because we go in with a preconceived idea about, okay, I run this system, but this system may not necessarily meet the demands of what the athletes, one, who the athlete is, or what the sport actually is. And I'm going to run a 5-3-1, and we're going to bench dead back on these days, back squat on these days, and we're going to hit 95% of a 1RM 2 weeks out from competition, and it's very, very rigid. But the chaotic nature of the NBA, just, you have to be adaptable is the biggest thing. So shifting in an understanding and that approach has helped me enormously, and it's a current approach I'm taking now, working with women's water polo. Because again, you can't assess demands of swimming. There's what we have a tendency to rely on in GPS and heart rate and those types of things. The the technology just isn't there. So how do I assess what a training session or what a game actually does to those athletes? So some similarities there as well.
From a neuromuscular point of view, pre and post, you mentioned, first part of the question is, were you assessing or trying to assess what was going on pre-post games, pre-post training? And second part of the question, was it a shock to you, or did you struggle with having to be so flexible rather than I run this system? And I suppose the first question potentially leads to the second one, because it may allow you to have some data to be flexible and to guide you. So yeah, sorry, two questions thrown at you there within one.
Yep. First question yes. As practitioners, you're inquisitive, so you want to try to provide the best practice for the athletes that you're working with. So it's within your instincts to answer those questions. Whether or not you're actually capable of doing it is a whole nother thing, because of what we've already spoken about, and logistically, traveling with force plates and those types of things, and getting a player to come off court and jump, and maybe in the too hard basket, maybe not. So when you have opportunities to answer those questions, you would like to take them, and then understanding the impact when you are perhaps able to collect that information can help shape your program. So if we know that the game actually does potentiate the nervous system, then what's the impact of strength training post-game? Probably you're actually capitalizing on what the game has already done. But if the game is fatiguing, you may shy away from certain things, or select other methodologies to keep the needle ticking forward. So in answer to the second question there, it's pretty common for NBA players to complete strength training sessions post-game. And you always put that down to the schedule, again, with how many games there are, and the rare ability to train on a training day. I think from memory, I could be totally wrong here, but I think there was one season where over the course of the year we had maybe 17 practice sessions, including preseason, and preseason was 4 or 5 days in length. So you don't have a huge ability to push the needle forward during those days. So you have to capitalize on make the most of your ability to do that post game. So you do it, you put those sessions there because that's what the schedule dictates, but understanding exercise selection or methodology as a result of that came second. So the intervention strategies certainly evolved as we understood, what happened to players, and not just happened to an NBA player, say, in general, but also then what would happen to certain athletes and during certain phases of the year, and if they would potentially be playing high minutes versus lower minutes, and then simple manipulation of volume and intensity of exercises, or even lift modality could potentially change as well. Again, still pushing the needle forward so that you're looking to optimize that adaptation, but without changing too much too, so that when the athlete comes in post game and you've got 30 minutes, particularly on the road, because the hurdle will sound and coach will come in and do his post game address, and then there's media and showers and food, and your wheels up 90 minutes after a game, and you have to lift on occasion. You can't take an hour. You have to be very short, sharp, concise, and very precise with what you're doing. So not having so much variability and variety with, say, exercise selection, so the athletes know what they're doing, but then having subtle changes that are manipulated based on what the game tells us is obviously really critical.
What changed throughout your time in Orlando with your thought process around that those post-game sessions? You said the word precision or precise. did that get sharp? Like, did the arrow get sharper in terms of your programming for that time, and what did it look like? I mean, we had Corey Schlesinger on the podcast a while ago who spoke. I don't want to mention it because I think he hates becoming this guy, but the fixed resistance machines been a larger part of his post game programming than maybe what people would expect. Just take that technical element away, but actually trying to get specific adaptations. It'd be interesting to get your insights of how your philosophy developed across your time.
I think the simplest way to answer that question is you would have to look at what we would travel with post to complete weight sessions post game, and it was also largely influenced by COVID because you couldn't share facilities and or equipment with the opposition team, and every team has to provide the opposition with a cart which has some dumbbells and a barbell and Swiss balls and some bare essentials to get a stimulus. So initially that was sort of all we would really utilize, and there's also some facilities have a more structured weight room as opposed to others. So you would also be possibly selective of where you would do your strength sessions based on equipment that you have available, and again the schedule would dictate that. The first part of my second year, it was the same because it was pre-COVID, but then once we entered the COVID times, and the health and hygiene was obviously at the height of everyone's concern, and you may be in arenas where you could share weight facilities with the opposition team. That was now a no-go. So in my third season, the 2019-2020 season, so 2020-2021 season, we were traveling, still playing, in away arenas, some with fans, some with no fans, based on local state rules and regulations and what have you. But we would travel with upwards of 300 kilo weight, Olympic barbells, K-boxes, just whatever we could to get the right stimulus for those guys in those lifts. We also had the luxury of the way that the schedule was set up, is that the league tried to minimize the amount of travel that you were doing. So if you were playing New York, you'd probably play the Knicks, and you'd also play Brooklyn within the same little window, so you weren't flying back and forth and what have you. So that was nice in a lot of ways. But then as we transitioned into the final, my final season there, it was trying to find a solution that would still serve the right purpose, and utilizing, whether it was an isometric stimulus or a mechanical stimulus, how do you do the same thing? And Matt stumbled across a piece of equipment that we trialed and was really, I think, quite successful and portable, and still provided a heavy enough strength stimulus for those guys to complete post game, and it did the job in keeping players available to play and available to train. So I think the evolution of the equipment that you travel with kind of answers the question as far as how precise where you are with your prescription, because you kind of work out what you need and what you actually don't need. And if you know the tools that you have in the toolkit and the job they're going to fix, then to grab the 12-inch or the Phillips head versus the flathead screwdriver, for example. So it's just those little things that you start to pick up on, and part of that is just being in the environment and developing your own heuristics and intuition as well.
Is that piece of equipment going to stay secret with Matt?
Vitruvian was what it was called. So
okay.
It's a similar to, say, a tonal, one of those wall-mounted machines, but it's on the floor. Magnetic resistance is what it's based on, and unlike some of the other pieces, can go up to 200 kilos worth of resistance. So quite a heavy. Regardless of who you are, that's heavy for anybody. So it can still serve a purpose. And from memory, they're primarily for domestic use. But to steal a line from Tabs here, being innovative is perhaps just finding a better solution to a pre-existing problem, and even though that was nothing new and overly crazy, it served a purpose and did the job.
What's it called, mate? Just say that name again.
Vitruvian Form. So Australian company based out of Perth.
Right. I'd like to go back to the assessment side of things and maybe get a couple of examples, obviously not mentioning players' names, not putting you in uncomfortable positions that you don't particularly want to be in. But just going back to the assessments that you conducted, how, if and how those actually related and led on to changes in the interventions that you prescribed for these athletes. And if there's any examples or theoretical examples, that would be great if possible.
Yes, jumping, running based sport, the incidence of, we all know that tendinopathy, for example, is quite prevalent in basketball, volleyball, netball, court sports. So, regardless of what assessment, whether it be through focal loading, through a isometric or an IKD, or through a Nordic or whatever you're going to be looking at, what's the capacity and what's the expression of that change in perhaps tendon property, and then giving more targeted intervention strategy based on how it's expressed, obviously. So if you're seeing glaring asymmetries with, say, jump strategy, and they're perhaps trending negatively, then what decisions are you making in order to impact that? So whether it's the use of, say, BFR, pre or post session for an analgesic effect or hormonal, how are you utilizing those strategies? And then again, if it's say an unreactive tendon, are you using yielding or quasi-isometrics? These types of questions that you can start to answer, and obviously then as you see responses progress along that continuum to again push the needle in the right direction.
Interesting. So just to go, and maybe we've covered this, it may be just almost a rehash of what we said. No, absolutely. I mean, we could. I'm just conscious of putting you in positions that you don't want to be in based on previous employer and all that kind of stuff.
The other part of it too, I guess, is take a tendon or just anything for example, that if there's variation, if there would be variation in load from a game, how is that expressed with, say, EDRFD, your ability to stop and on a limb, and whether that's a change in strategy or a change in output. What strategies again are you using there? So if an athlete typically responds because they play, say, high minutes, but for a reason, whether it be coach selection or injury or whatever it might be, they may have been substituting for a maybe better player and they've dropped back down the rotation, but you still want to keep that capacity high, then you're simply going to be putting more potentially EDRFD jump landing drills into their post-workout session. So just those little subtle things, but again, understanding what you're looking at, why you're looking at it, and how it's expressed in a game is really, really critical there.
Again, the question that came to mind, you said if you were going to go walk into the weight room in Orlando, you'd see quite I don't know if you would use the word simple, but uncomplicated program. However, there was a lot of thought that went behind each programming decision. If someone was to walk into that weight room when you were there, would they see multiple programs going on depending on very different programs going on depending on the individual, or would they see quite a generic program with minor tweaks? I think this is something that the individualization conversation is one that has come up all the time in the podcast, with very individualized training. The thought that everyone has this remarkably different set of exercises, set of loading parameters, all that kind of stuff. But in practice, does that actually happen? Is that actually needed within the environment that you're working in?
I think it works regardless of what environment you're working in. I think it works if you're one-on-one or if you have like the say NSCA rule of 5-to-1, athlete to coach ratio. Like you could do it. Where it gets tricky is, again, time. I think the more you individualize a program, the more individual coaching that you have to do. And if that's not in your capacity based on athlete to staff ratios, or in our case, time, you ask the question of where can I get the most bang for your buck? So you would perhaps walk in and see a very simple program with generic exercise classification or selection, but subtle changes in certain aspects of certain drills, or reduction of, say, plyo drills or more plyo drills, or if an athlete is perhaps more strength dominant and is a strength responder, well, then they're going to be more strength biased. Even if you say using VBT, your targets that you're prescribing are going to be more geared towards what they would need. Every athlete could be trapped by deadlifting, but their VBT target is going to be more suited to what they need versus someone who's going to be, say, on the strength speed or speed strength side of things. So again, if you bird's eye view, every athlete may be completing almost the same exercises, but those subtle differences in programming, I think, make the differences there with being an individualized approach. And I think, as I said, the only way I think you can really, really do it and provide high quality coaching is in those one-on-one or 1-to-5 situations.
Just to round up, last couple of minutes, if you were to go back into that environment, or reflecting on your time there, I suppose is a better way to frame it, reflecting on your time there, is there anything that you would do differently now, coming out of it, reflecting on it, think about what you did, think about what you didn't, think about the decisions you made, didn't make? What would you do differently, if anything?
That's a really good question. The beginning, this is maybe a combination of hard skill and just me as a person. I totally underestimated the impact it would have on me, emotionally, moving overseas and setting up my life for myself and my wife, by myself, and going into a foreign country, even though it's English speaking, and house, car, bank accounts, all those things that I didn't even consider until I actually got there, that I wish I had been more prepared for and understood more about the processes in which I needed to go through to do that. And the club were outstanding in helping me do that. But I was also the first foreign employee within the basketball operations department. So they were learning the processes too, because it's obviously different for players with different visas and all those types of things. The second thing I would go back and invest more time in before going over is having a better understanding of the medical system, and initially my role as a performance and rehab coach with the directive to come in and make change to rehab processes and some of those bits and pieces. I had no idea that there was an athletic trainer and a physical therapist. So understanding what their specific roles are along a rehab continuum, how do you maximize their skill sets? And then you throw a rehab coach on top of it, which I think if you're in an Australian setting, you're someone with a strength conditioning background with a better understanding of loading adaptation, and you take on-field sessions or on-court sessions and all those types of things. But in that environment, it's facilitated differently, and I wasn't aware of that. So I've admitted this on a few occasions now, and that was something that I wish I had have gone back in and invested in for my own education earlier, simply because the progress that we made could have been made earlier on, and that's something I wish I could have gone back and, if I had my time over, I'll do that differently.
Nice. Cool. Right, mate. If anyone wants to reach out to you, have a little chat around water polo, NBA, whatever it is, where's the best place for people to catch you?
I've got all the socials: Twitter, Instagram. Twitter handle is at Nath Spencer. Instagram is at Performance Coach Spencer, or just through my NSWIS affiliated email address is the other way to get in touch with me. But either one of those is probably the best way to go about it. I'm not as active on those things as I probably could be, and it's definitely an endeavour of mine to dive into that space a little bit more. But yeah, that's probably it.
Nice, mate. Well, thank you for being so open and honest about your time in the MBA and what you're doing now and all that kind of stuff and the reflections that you've had since leaving. Really appreciate it, and obviously all the technical stuff in terms of monitoring profiling as well. So really appreciate you coming on. Great to chat to you in this capacity versus just WhatsApp messages and WhatsApp voice notes. So I appreciate your time and look forward to keeping in touch.
All right. Thanks, mate. Appreciate the invite.
Thanks, buddy.